Hello, I'm Anawiltus, and today I'd like to talk about Koinonism versus utopianism. So, is Koinonism a utopian ideology? Well, in practice, Koinonism is not utopian in a number of different ways. First of all, it it very prominently focuses on realistic elements, that is to say, power dynamics, uh, social dynamics, as well as the idea that changing society in a drastic way, social engineering, is something that is difficult. And in fact, Koinonism doesn't actually at all try to engage in social engineering in any major way, except for through the general structure of its government. But that's mostly designed in order to as a method of choosing leaders, which isn't really social engineering because it isn't really going down to the individual level of people in a society and trying to change the hearts and minds of the people living in a society. So in that sense, it is not utopian because it does not seek to change people on the inside. Rather, the leadership system is designed to choose from among existing people in order to find competent leaders among them. And I think that within a large enough group of people, you're likely to find some competent leaders. And of course, the existence of competent leaders and the competitiveness uh, is is an observable effect. That is to say, that if you have a competition for leadership, then in theory you could get people competing to be better leaders. Now, the problem I see is that the way many governments are structured ultimately leads, rather than a competition in the capability of leaders, leads to a competition in the publicity skill of leaders, which I don't think should be as important as other elements of leadership. And therefore, I think that's a failure of a number of different systems, including the American system, which it is not designed to adapt to the growth of the population in a way that allows for leadership that is more based on skill rather than publicity. Because when the population grows in a group of people, it means that the leader has direct contact and personal interaction with a smaller and smaller proportion of the people as the population grows, because you can only have so many people that you interact with in your daily life. So, in that sense, it makes you harder to hold accountable in a very personal way, which means that you end up having to engage in publicity campaigns. And as the population grows larger, you have to focus more on publicity campaigns, and you have to rely less on your experience, less on your reputation in the business, and less on your reputation personally, of what people think about you personally. Because as the population gets larger, people won't be able to know you personally, and that's a problem. And that's why Koinonism is structured in a way that, through a hierarchy, allows these personal relationships and these smaller electoral groups to function. And I don't think that that's utopian, because it's not something that is unique. The idea of having a social hierarchy is not something that is unique to Koinonism, nor is it something that is unique to theoretical politics. It is something that is very real, something that has existed in very many societies throughout history. So, in that sense, it is not a utopian quality. So, utopian systems tend to have elements that have never been implemented in a government. Now, while I would like to say that Koinonism as a whole obviously has not been implemented at the time that I'm recording this in any country. Various elements of it have been implemented, and various other elements have proofs of concept. So, economically speaking, monetarism is not something that's considered to be a sort of kooky crackpot theory. It's just people disagree with it in certain areas because they have different economic interests to what monetarism promotes. So it's not as if that particular element is considerably utopian. The idea of having a decentralized socioeconomic system is also not something that is new or untested. I think there's very many countries throughout history that have had such elements, including the Roman Empire, where local government generally had very large degrees of authority, and the Roman Republic before that as well. So, in that sense, the decentralization and the hierarchy and the economic policies are not utopian. So I'm not requiring people in Koinonism to behave any differently than they normally would, to necessarily have a particular way to be educated, to behave in an unusual economic fashion. And I'm not expecting them to ignore traditional hierarchy models. I'm not expecting them to abandon their cultures, their traditions, their economic interests, their religion, etc. I'm not expecting any of that. And therefore, Koinonism is very much a non-utopian ideology. And therefore, and in fact, the way I decided what types of policies are involved in Koinonism, what are the core elements of Koinonism, the way I decided that is by looking at the failures of various governments, the real failures of various governments, and examining what the potential ways are to mitigate those failures. Not in any grand sense, not in saying that we're going to prevent this for all time, not in saying that there's never ever going to be rebellion, that we're never ever going to have a dangerous foreign adversary, we're never ever going to have corruption anywhere in the government, but rather that if anything happens, if something happens, we have a way to deal with it. And I think that's what's important. And that's a big difference between realist systems and utopian systems, is that utopian systems believe that the problems that we have are problems that we can get rid of. I'm not of that opinion. I don't think that through governmental structure, through the restructuring of a society, that we can get rid of the core problems that produce the decay in a society in the first place. No, rather, I think that by structuring this, we can mitigate problems in the same way as, historically speaking, governments themselves have restructured in order to solve various problems in the past. Essentially, I'm following a long legal tradition going back to the founding fathers of the United States, as well as the founding fathers of the Roman state in ancient times, and going and expanding to various realist philosophers, to Chinese legalism. I think that's something that is definitely worth studying. So in that sense, I'm not a utopian because my ideology does not possess any of the general qualities of a utopian ideology. So in that sense, that is the general distinction. And to say one more thing, an example of a utopian ideology, I think would be the idea of Marxism. This idea that you can take a society and establish in between an in between state, the dictatorship of the proletariat, and then from that you reach a state where the government is no longer necessary, everybody is communalized, and it just runs itself. I don't think that that is in line with the general tendency of human beings, and that is why I think the problem with utopian states is that ultimately, in order to reach a state of being where where enough people in their society agree with their society in order to run their society, they have to kill a lot of people. And that's a large problem, and that's why my ideology, in large respects, is designed in a way that ultimately prevents this type of centralized control that leads to the situation that necessitates the deaths of large numbers of people in order to assure social compliance with the utopian agenda. Because I think the weakness of a system falls on how many people in that system are required to be enthusiastic about the system for the system to prevail. And I'm going to be honest here, anarchic systems require a very high amount of enthusiasm. And that is why anarchic systems are generally considered to be utopian, and also why many realists believe anarchic systems will fail, because they require a very large amount of enthusiasm. And while obviously you don't want people hating the system they live in, because that leads to rebellion, okay? From a realistic perspective, we can't just look at how we want people to behave, but we also have to look at how people behave despite how we want them to. In regards to that, the idea is that even if people aren't entirely invested in the system itself, even if people aren't interested in the system itself, the system still needs to be able to prevail. And that's why in a society there is a necessity for being able to place imperatives upon people. That is to say, if a criminal exists and commits a crime, okay, then there needs to be a way to enforce that. Or if there's a foreign power that is threatening you, there needs to be a way to deal with that threat. Or if there's a military coup, there needs to be a way to deal with that threat. Or if there is some corruption high in the government, there needs to be a way to deal with that threat. So the problem-solving element in any such society is what we call the government. And I know that there's people that like to talk about private law societies, etc. And I think maybe to some extent that could work, but I think that being able to place imperatives upon people without their consent is actually going to allow you to produce a society where people are less likely to dissent. Because in Koinonism, they do have the ability to pursue their socioeconomic goals. And the responsibility for these problems is distributed in a way that allows people to engage in society without having to fear sectarian oppression, which is, I think, a major problem that a lot of people have. And that's what I think is a major weakness in more libertarian systems. That is to say, I would say total libertarian systems. That is to say that these systems are libertarian not just in the way that they treat people as individuals, not just in the way that they are decentralized, but in a more total sense where the people have so many negative rights that it becomes very difficult for imperatives to be imposed upon them. So the people that are actually interested in having a greater control in their community on these things become upset because they can't have that under this system. So instead, why don't we just do both and have them separate? And I think that is likely to work. Not because I have this idea in my mind that people will magically get along, but rather because this is something that we see in history and it has worked very many times before. So tell me what you think. Do you think Koinonism is utopian? Do you disagree with a certain point I made? Thank you all for watching, and I will be seeing you all next time on the Wiltus Over and Out.